Long before it became a modern state known for its beaches, cities, and endless sunshine, the land of Florida existed as a wild, untamed frontier, shaped by water, heat, and time. It was a land unlike any other in North America, where dense swamps, winding rivers, and vast wetlands created both opportunity and danger. This unique environment would define Florida's history from the very beginning, influencing the people who lived there and the empires that fought to control it. Thousands of years before European explorers arrived, Florida was home to diverse and complex Native American cultures. Tribes such as the Timucua, Calusa, and Appalachee thrived across the region, each adapting to the environment in different ways. Along the coasts, the Calusa built powerful societies based on fishing rather than farming, constructing massive shell mounds that still stand today as evidence of their engineering and organization. Inland, the Timucua and Appalachee developed agricultural systems, growing crops like maize, beans, and squash. These societies were deeply connected to the land. Florida's environment demanded respect. Its swamps were difficult to navigate, its wildlife could be dangerous, and its climate was unforgiving. But for those who understood it, the land provided everything needed for survival. Rivers and coastlines served as transportation routes, forests offered shelter and resources, and the abundance of fish and game sustained entire communities. For centuries, these civilizations flourished, largely undisturbed by the outside world. But in the early 16th century, everything changed. In 1513, a Spanish explorer named Ponce de León arrived on Florida's shores, becoming the first known European to explore the region. He named the land La Florida, meaning land of flowers, inspired by the lush vegetation and the timing of his arrival during the Easter season, known in Spanish as Pascua Florida. His expedition marked the beginning of European interest in Florida, but it was only the first step in a long and often brutal history of exploration and colonization. Spain saw Florida as strategically valuable. It served as a gateway to the Gulf of Mexico and a defensive barrier protecting its more profitable colonies in the Caribbean and Mexico. However, establishing a permanent presence in Florida proved to be far more difficult than expected. Early Spanish expeditions faced immense challenges. The environment was harsh and unfamiliar, and resistance from Native American tribes was strong. Attempts to establish settlements often ended in failure, with disease, starvation, and conflict taking a heavy toll. It wasn't until 1565 that Spain successfully established a permanent settlement in Florida. That year, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés founded St. Augustine, which would become the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the United States. This marked a turning point in Florida's history, as it became a key outpost of the Spanish Empire in North America. St. Augustine served both as a military base and a center of colonial administration. Fortifications were built to defend against attacks, including the construction of the Castillo de San Marcos, a massive stone fortress designed to withstand both enemy assaults and the test of time. The settlement became a focal point for Spanish influence in the region, but it was never a place of great wealth or ease. Life in Spanish Florida was difficult. The colony lacked the riches found in other parts of the Spanish Empire, such as gold or silver. Instead, it relied on agriculture, trade, and support from other Spanish territories. Relations with Native American tribes were complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile. Spanish missionaries sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, establishing missions throughout the region. These missions became centers of cultural exchange, but also sources of tension. While some Native Americans adapted to the new system, others resisted, leading to conflicts that would persist for decades. Additionally, European diseases, to which Native Americans had no immunity, devastated local populations, causing dramatic declines and altering the social landscape of the region. Florida's strategic importance made it a target for rival European powers. The British, in particular, sought to challenge Spanish control. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Florida became a battleground for imperial conflict. Raids, skirmishes, and shifting alliances defined this period, as control of the region changed hands multiple times. In 1763, following the 7 Years' War, Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain. The British divided the territory into East Florida and West Florida, introducing new systems of governance and encouraging settlement. However, British control would not last long. After the American Revolution, Florida was returned to Spain in 1783. Yet, by this time, the region was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. American settlers were moving into nearby territories, and conflicts continued with Native American groups, including the Seminoles, a people who would come to play a central role in Florida's history. By the early 19th century, Spain's hold on Florida was weakening. The United States, expanding rapidly, saw Florida as a valuable addition to its territory. In 1821, Spain officially ceded Florida to the United States, marking the end of centuries of European colonial rule. Under American control, Florida entered a new phase. Settlers began to move into the territory in greater numbers, establishing farms and communities. However, this expansion led to increased conflict with the Seminole people, who resisted displacement from their lands. These tensions erupted into a series of conflicts known as the Seminole Wars, some of the longest and most costly wars fought by the United States against Native American tribes. The Seminoles used the difficult terrain of Florida, the swamps, forests, and wetlands, to their advantage, making it incredibly challenging for American forces to defeat them. Despite fierce resistance, many Seminoles were eventually forced to relocate westward, though some remained, retreating deep into the Everglades where they preserved their way of life. In 1845, Florida was admitted to the Union as the 27th state. At the time, it was still sparsely populated, with much of its land undeveloped. Its economy was largely based on agriculture, including crops like cotton and sugar, and like many southern states, it relied heavily on enslaved labor. Florida's early history as a state was shaped by its geography and its past. It was a place of contrasts, lush and beautiful, yet harsh and unforgiving, rich in resources, yet difficult to tame. Its position as a gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico made it strategically important, while its environment made it uniquely challenging. Through centuries of exploration, conflict, and survival, Florida developed an identity unlike any other state. It was a land shaped by Native American heritage, European ambition, and the relentless forces of nature. And as the sun set over its vast wetlands and the waves of its coastlines continued to crash against the shore, Florida stood as a testament to endurance, a place where history was not just written, but fought for, survived, and carried forward into a future that was only just beginning. As Florida entered the mid-19th century, it was still a young and developing state, vast, underpopulated, and deeply tied to the traditions of the American South. Its economy relied heavily on agriculture, particularly cotton, sugar, and cattle ranching. Large plantations stretched across northern Florida, worked by enslaved people whose labor sustained the system. Though Florida lacked the massive plantation economy of states like Mississippi or Alabama, it was still firmly rooted in the institution of slavery, and this would shape its path in the years to come. When tensions between the North and South reached a breaking point in 1861, Florida joined the Confederacy, becoming the third state to secede from the Union. Though it was not one of the most industrialized or populous Confederate states, Florida played a crucial supporting role during the Civil War. Its vast lands were used to supply food, cattle, and salt, essential resources for Confederate armies. Unlike states that saw massive and repeated battles, much of Florida remained relatively untouched by large-scale destruction. However, it was far from peaceful. Skirmishes, raids, and naval blockades disrupted daily life, especially along the coast. Union forces targeted key supply routes and ports, aiming to weaken the Confederacy's ability to sustain itself. One of the most significant engagements in Florida was the Battle of Olustee in 1864, where Confederate forces secured a victory against Union troops. Despite this, the overall tide of the war was turning against the Confederacy. As Union forces gained control of more territory, Florida's role as a supplier became increasingly difficult to maintain. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Florida, like the rest of the South, faced the immense challenge of rebuilding. The abolition of slavery marked a profound shift in its social and economic structure. The plantation system, which had defined much of the state's economy, was thrown into uncertainty. Formerly enslaved people were now free, but they faced a difficult and often hostile environment as they sought to build new lives. The Reconstruction era brought attempts to reshape Florida's society. New laws were introduced to grant rights to African Americans, including the right to vote and hold public office. For a brief period, there was significant political participation among black citizens, and efforts were made to rebuild infrastructure and expand education. However, these changes were met with strong resistance. Many white Floridians sought to maintain control and restore the old social order. As Reconstruction came to an end in the late 1870s, many of the gains made during this period were reversed. Segregation laws were enacted, and systems were put in place to limit the rights of African Americans, creating a deeply unequal society that would persist for decades. Despite these challenges, Florida began to slowly grow and change. One of the key factors driving this transformation was the expansion of railroads. In the late 19th century, railroad lines pushed deeper into the state, connecting previously isolated areas and opening up new opportunities for settlement and trade. Among the most influential figures in this development was Henry Flagler, a businessman who played a major role in shaping Florida's future. He extended railroad lines down the East Coast, making travel to Florida faster and more accessible than ever before. Alongside these roads, he developed luxury hotels, transforming Florida into a destination for wealthy tourists. This marked the beginning of Florida's tourism industry, one that would eventually become one of the most important pillars of its economy. Visitors from the northern United States were drawn to Florida's warm climate, especially during the winter months. What had once been seen as a remote and difficult land was now being reimagined as a place of beauty and opportunity. Cities began to grow. Jacksonville became a major transportation and commercial hub, while Tampa developed as a center for trade and cigar manufacturing. Further south, small settlements began to expand, laying the foundations for what would later become major cities like Miami. Agriculture also evolved during this period. While cotton declined in importance, other crops rose to prominence. Citrus fruits, particularly oranges, became one of Florida's most recognizable products. The state's climate proved ideal for citrus farming, and groves spread across the landscape. However, growth was not without setbacks. Florida's environment, which had always been both a blessing and a challenge, continued to shape its development. Hurricanes, freezes, and disease could devastate crops and communities. The Great Freeze of the 1890s, for example, destroyed large portions of the citrus industry in northern Florida, forcing growers to move further south. As the 20th century approached, Florida was entering a new era. Its identity was beginning to shift, from a rural, agricultural state to one increasingly defined by tourism, transportation, and migration. The population was growing, and new opportunities were emerging. The early 1900s brought a land boom unlike anything the state had seen before. Developers promoted Florida as a paradise, attracting investors and settlers eager to take advantage of rising property values. Cities expanded rapidly, and construction projects transformed the landscape. But this boom was fragile. By the mid-1920s, the real estate market collapsed, leading to economic hardship. This was followed by devastating hurricanes that caused widespread destruction, and then the Great Depression, which further slowed the state's growth. Yet, even in the face of these challenges, Florida continued to evolve. Its warm climate and natural beauty remained powerful attractions, and its strategic location made it important for military training during World War II. Bases were established across the state, bringing new infrastructure and economic activity. The war also introduced many people to Florida for the first time. Soldiers who trained there often returned later in life, contributing to the state's population growth in the decades that followed. By the mid-20th century, Florida was on the brink of another transformation, one that would turn it into one of the fastest-growing states in the nation.